The projector clicked, word, and cast its flickering light across the polished briefing room. Around the table sat 6 Soviet generals, 4 intelligence officers, and 1 man from the Ministry of Defense who hadn't blinked in over 20 minutes. On the wall ahead, grainy satellite footage played on loop rows of American M1 Abrams tanks, charging across the Iraqi desert, not scattered, not improvising, but moving in perfect formation, flanked by fuel convoys, supported by artillery, and guided by supply drones. To the Soviets, it looked more like choreography than combat, and that was the problem. It wasn't the tanks that caused the stir. The Soviets had studied them for decades. It wasn't the speed. Either they had trained for blitz-style warfare since 1945. No. What shook them was the seamlessness. The realization that every piece of the American war machine moved like a single organism. No Soviet doctrine accounted for that. Desert Storm had ended weeks earlier. But in Moscow, the real analysis was just beginning. Soviet command had expected a quagmire. They believed the U.S. would get bogged down in terrain, logistics, and bureaucracy. Instead, they watched what one stunned colonel described as a rolling city of firepower, fueled in real time, with precision we didn't think possible. American aircraft refueled in midair, executed nightly bombing runs with 0 logistical delays, and returned to forward bases that somehow never ran out of munitions. When Soviet planners estimated how long it would take to sustain 500,000 troops in the desert, they predicted 6 months minimum. The Americans did it in half that, with time to spare. It didn't make sense. According to Soviet models, the American supply chain should have collapsed after week 2. Ports should have jammed. Roads should have clogged. Units should have run dry. Instead, everything kept moving, not just at the front, everywhere. Across the Persian Gulf, U.S. Navy supply ships offloaded thousands of tons of equipment with containerized precision. In Saudi Arabia, entire base camps had been built before the main forces arrived. And inside the Pentagon, digital logistics systems tracked every shipment down to the individual box. Spare parts for helicopters were airlifted mid-battle. Water tanks were restocked before troops even knew they were running low. One Soviet general leaned forward and whispered what the others feared to say aloud. We didn't lose to tanks. We lost to logistics. What followed in that briefing room wasn't a technical review, it was a crisis of faith. Because for the first time since World War II, the Soviet military saw not just an enemy advantage, but a complete collapse of their assumptions. The Cold War had been fought in simulations, in doctrine, in theory. Now, in the real world. The United States had revealed its true weapon, not stealth, not firepower, but the ability to move, supply, and fight faster than the Soviets could even react. And for Soviet strategists, that wasn't just a defeat. It was a revelation. The year was 1955, and deep within a military planning hall in Moscow, a chalkboard bore the future of the Soviet Union's war doctrine. It was a vision forged in the fires of Stalingrad and tempered by the Soviet obsession with scale tank columns stretching to the horizon, artillery that moved like thunder, and troops surging in mechanized waves across the European plain. But behind it all was one critical assumption that wars would be short, brutal, and decided by massed force. In those early decades of the Cold War, Soviet planners didn't just underestimate U.S. logistics, they dismissed it outright. American dependency on long supply chains, civilian contractors, and modular planning was viewed as a fatal weakness. The Soviets believed that once the initial NATO line broke, Supply units would fail to keep pace, infrastructure would buckle, and the Americans, spoiled by abundance, would collapse under pressure. It was a doctrine built on confidence in momentum. Soviet deep battle theory emphasized shock, punch through, bypass resistance, and encircle logistics. Fuel and food wouldn't matter if your enemy was overrun before they could respond. But inside NATO command, a different kind of war was being imagined. While Soviet war games focused on tanks and attrition, American planners studied resilience. The Pentagon began investing not just in firepower, but in infrastructure, redundant supply lines, real-time tracking systems, and strategic prepositioning. To the Soviets, this seemed laughably complex. Soviet supply chains were simpler bulk movement on rail, centralized control, and stockpiles managed by brute calculation. The downside: they were rigid. Every breakthrough required weeks of reallocation. Fuel delays could stall entire divisions. There was no real-time adaptability, only forecasts. American systems, on the other hand, looked slow until they didn't. While the Soviet Union relied on speed of attack, the U.S. built speed of support. It wasn't flashy, it didn't make headlines, but it was scalable, survivable, and global. By the 1970s, signs of this emerging doctrine were everywhere. The U.S. began deploying prepositioned equipment in Europe, Asia, and even aboard naval supply ships. These weren't just warehouses, they were launch pads. Every box, every canister was accounted for by an emerging system of computerized logistics. Not glamorous, not deadly, but devastatingly efficient. Soviet doctrine dismissed it as Western excess. But by the late 1980s, a quiet group within the KGB's military analysis branch began asking the uncomfortable question: what if this excess was actually a weapon? Because if logistics didn't break, if fuel always arrived, if munitions were never short, if battalions could redeploy in hours instead of days, then the entire Soviet war plan fell apart. Every Soviet exercise assumed that American forces would run out of breath after the opening days, but NATO wasn't running out. It was warming up, inside that room in Moscow. The chalkboard full of assumptions was about to be erased not by missiles or ideology, but by something no Soviet general had ever feared before: an American spreadsheet. For nearly 5 decades, the Soviet Union had treated logistics as a secondary function, something that followed strategy, not shaped it. They weren't alone. Most military doctrines of the early Cold War viewed supply as a matter of scale move enough. Fuel, food, and bullets forward, and the front line would hold. But the U.S. had quietly rewritten the rule book. The Soviets built a war machine to win fast. The Americans built one to keep fighting forever. Soviet doctrine was rooted in what they called deep operations, a layered, multi-echelon system that aimed to punch through NATO defenses in waves. Once the front cracked, tank divisions would pour in, supported by mechanized infantry and mobile artillery. Every movement was timed, every fuel drop scheduled, every victory expected within days. But buried in that doctrine was a fatal assumption that supplies would always be where they were supposed to be. The Soviet supply chain, elegant in theory, was built on fixed rail networks, centralized depots, and highly choreographed replenishment. It was fast, but only in straight lines. Divert a unit from its planned route, and the whole system faltered. Break a bridge, stall a rail car, reroute a battalion, and delays rippled through the entire offensive. By contrast, the American system looked like chaos, at least on the surface. It wasn't as rigid. It wasn't as linear. But that was its power. Where the Soviets relied on predetermined supply nodes, the U.S. embraced mobility, trucks, cargo planes, helicopters, maritime prepositioning ships, all part of a vast web that could shift with the battlefield. The U.S. wasn't trying to outrun Soviet units, it was trying to outlast them. At NATO exercises in West Germany, U.S. logistics officers rehearsed just-in-time delivery methods, using barcoded inventories and computerized tracking to deliver fuel within meters of the front. Soviet planners mocked these exercises until they saw how rapidly NATO forces could recover from simulated ambushes. A U.S. unit knocked out in a war game could rearm, redeploy, and strike again within 72 hours. A Soviet unit often needed a week, and it wasn't just speed, it was scale, where Soviet supply officers worked within rigid weight limits, moving fuel by rail, food by convoy, and parts in bulk. The U.S. had built a system of modular logistics. Containers packed in Fort Hood could be offloaded in Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, with minimal adjustment. A single C-5 Galaxy could carry spare engines, ammunition pallets, and fully loaded medical shelters at the same time. The Pentagon had adopted a core philosophy: logistics first, strategy second. The Soviets had never imagined such a doctrine, because in their model, supply lines followed the battle. In America's model, supply lines defined the battle. It was doctrine on the verge of collapse. A system optimized for a war that would never come against an enemy who had built a weapon the Soviets had never even recognized: the global logistics network. At exactly 0300 hours on January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began. While the world focused on the shock and awe of Tomahawk missiles slamming into Iraqi command centers, Soviet observers were watching something very different. They were watching the rear. In the opening 48 hours, U.S. forces launched over 1,000 sorties per day. But what astonished Soviet analysts wasn't the aircraft, it was the sustainment. Every sortie required fuel, ordnance, maintenance crews, and mission planning. Yet not a single American airbase reported a shortage. That was impossible. The Soviets had calculated the supply burden for such an operation years earlier. For every 100 fighter sorties, their models predicted dozens of fuel convoys, maintenance delays, and at least a 20% drop in sortie rate by day 3. Instead, the Americans increased their tempo. Airfields across Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar lit up like circuits on a motherboard. Each one had been stocked weeks in advance with pallets of bombs, jet fuel bladders, mobile command units, and spare parts by prepositioned ships that had arrived before the first troops even set foot in the theater. By day 5, American planes were not only maintaining sortie rates, they were flying more missions than Soviet models thought physically possible. Back in Moscow, military planners stared at logistics throughput estimates from intercepted radio traffic. Numbers didn't lie. Ammunition consumption was being matched in real time. Fuel levels never dropped. Entire wings were being rearmed faster than Soviet doctrine even allowed for on paper. One colonel reportedly whispered, "Either our estimates are wrong, or their system is not human." It wasn't just the Air Force. On the ground, U.S. Army units were rolling forward with mile-long convoys behind them, each equipped with GPS-tracked trucks, satellite-linked dispatchers, and digital manifests. A single tank battalion consumed more fuel in one day than an entire Soviet motor rifle regiment. But the fuel never stopped flowing. Soviet planners couldn't believe it. Then came the true shock. The 24th Infantry Division executed a flanking maneuver that took them 150 miles behind Iraqi lines without pausing to resupply. Fuel bladders had been leapfrogged across the desert. Rations were airlifted by CH-47s. Ammunition came from mobile depots tracked via satellite. That maneuver wasn't just bold, it was logistically impossible under Soviet standards. Yet it happened. And then it happened again and again. In less than 100 hours, U.S. ground forces rolled through a hostile desert, engaged a dug-in army, and reached their objectives without a single unit running dry. That wasn't supposed to be achievable. The Soviet command had long dismissed U.S. logistics as soft, bureaucratic, overstretched, and dependent on peacetime luxuries. Now, they were watching an armored force move with the efficiency of a freight company and the lethality of a strike group. It shattered the myth. This wasn't the war the Soviets had trained for. This was a new kind of warfare driven by real-time coordination, global supply webs, and a doctrine where logistics wasn't a burden, it was the primary weapon. The reports flowing in from KGB field agents and intercepted U.S. logistics transmissions didn't match Moscow's understanding of modern war. American divisions were outpacing fuel models. Frontline troops were being resupplied faster than Soviet rear units could be in training exercises, and the air campaign was operating on a 24-hour tempo without a single reported pause. Something had to be off. In February 1991, Soviet military analysts gathered in a closed session inside the Ministry of Defense's secure compound. Their task, reconstruct the logistics chain of U.S. forces during Operation Desert Storm using only observed data and declassified signals intelligence. What they produced was terrifying. According to their model, the United States had deployed a fully self-sustaining expeditionary force, one capable of moving, feeding, arming, and fueling itself across thousands of miles with virtually no visible gaps. Fuel depots had been established in Saudi Arabia months in advance. Munitions storage had been layered across sea, air, and land. Mobile water purification units, field hospitals, and repair centers followed the advance like shadows. One stunned officer from the GRU reportedly said, "This is not how empires fight. This is how corporations move." Still, some generals refused to believe it. Marshal Dmitry Yazov, then Minister of Defense, dismissed the findings. "Let's see how long they last in winter," he said. Referencing the Eastern European theater, the Soviets always considered the true test of war. He argued that the desert offered easy terrain, open skies, and no real logistical challenge, but others weren't so sure. In a confidential memo to the Politburo, an internal review team warned that U.S. logistics capabilities had become the decisive factor in conventional war and that Soviet planners had grossly underestimated the integration of American technology, automation, and private sector logistics models into military operations. The response from the political class: silence in public. Soviet leadership maintained the same line: American power was superficial, its troops too soft, its society too decadent, its supply system too complex to survive a real war. But behind closed doors, the cracks widened. At a classified war game in late 1991, a simulated NATO invasion was conducted using updated American logistics assumptions. The result: Soviet forces were encircled within 72 hours, not because of superior firepower, but because their fuel depots had been bypassed, their rail lines jammed, and their command posts overwhelmed by faster-moving, better-supplied units. A system once believed to be the world's most formidable now found itself outmaneuvered, not on the battlefield, but in the warehouse. The Soviet leadership had always believed the Cold War would be decided by ideology, by nuclear brinkmanship, or by sheer numbers. Instead, they were now confronting a darker possibility: that it would be lost because the other side knew how to move boxes better. For decades, Soviet military doctrine operated on a theory as old as war itself. He who arrives with more wins. And for most of the 20th century, that idea had worked. From the Eastern Front in World War II to the suppression of uprisings in Eastern Europe, Soviet power had always rested on scale: more tanks, more artillery, more men, more firepower. But by the 1980s, the Soviet High Command quietly realized something had shifted. They called it overmatch paralysis. It was the idea that even with superior numbers, Soviet forces could be neutralized by smaller, faster, better supported enemy units. Their theory was simple. U.S. logistics looked impressive, but it was fragile, too technical, too dependent on satellites, computers, and civilian contractors. In war, the Soviets believed those luxuries would vanish, so they trained for it. Their entire operational art was geared toward breaking logistics. Deep operations weren't just about flanking, they were about collapsing support systems, blow the fuel lines, jam the communications, cut the flow, and the enemy would grind to a halt. That was the theory. But Operation Desert Storm disproved it in real time. U.S. logistics didn't collapse under pressure, it thrived. Not only were support systems distributed, they were layered. If a fuel convoy was delayed, another route was already planned. If a warehouse was bombed, its inventory had already been decentralized. Redundancy wasn't just a feature, it was the foundation. Still, Soviet theorists clung to their assumptions in one now declassified analysis from the Soviet Military Academy. Analysts predicted that American supply chains would fail under three conditions: contested airspace, electronic interference, and disruption of central command. But each of those stress tests failed. American airlift operations proved autonomous and decentralized. Convoy routes were mapped digitally and could be rerouted instantly, even under jamming conditions. Supply chains functioned using pre-programmed resupply patterns and alternate frequencies. The American response to disruption wasn't panic, it was automation. And here lay the core flaw in the Soviet theory. They had mistaken complexity for fragility. They believed a system with more moving parts was easier to break. In truth, the USEC system had evolved from its corporate roots into something far more dangerous: adaptive complexity. Like a living organism, it didn't fail at the first break. It rerouted, it healed. By contrast, Soviet logistics resembled an armored column: direct, powerful, and brittle. One well-placed delay could stall an entire front. One miscalculated fuel drop could render a tank division inert. Their theory assumed everything would go right on their end and everything would go wrong on the enemy's. But in the Gulf, the opposite happened. And as Soviet generals watched CNN footage of U.S. logistics hubs glowing under floodlights, automated cranes moving containers like clockwork, and aircraft returning to refuel and rearm in under 30 minutes, the old theory began to crack. Victory wasn't going to the biggest force anymore. It was going to the side that could move, adapt, and fight faster than anyone else. And the Soviets. They were moving in slow motion. If the first Soviet miscalculation was that American logistics were fragile, the second was even more damning: that logistics didn't win wars, combat did. Soviet doctrine had always placed firepower and maneuver at the center of strategy. Supply was seen as a support element, not a decisive one. Commanders were judged by their kill ratios, their advances, their mastery of artillery barrages, not by how efficiently they moved fuel or tracked inventory. So when American forces began outmaneuvering Iraqi divisions, not just tactically, but logistically, Soviet observers scrambled for an explanation. Their second theory emerged quickly. It was only possible because of total air supremacy. In their view, U.S. logistics worked because they didn't have to worry about air threats. There were no Soviet-style bombers hunting convoys, no MiG-29s strafing supply depots. Of course, the Americans could resupply freely. They had cleared the skies. And while that was partially true, it was also fatally short-sighted, because what Soviet strategists missed was that air supremacy wasn't a starting condition, it was a product of logistics itself. U.S. aircraft maintained control of the skies because they could fly nonstop. Jets were refueled mid-air by a vast fleet of KC-135s and KC-10s. Missiles were replenished within hours of launch. Pilots rotated seamlessly because living quarters, food systems, and medical units were all pre-deployed in a combat zone. The entire U.S. command structure didn't just expect continuous operations, it was built for them. Air supremacy was a result, not a cause. Yet the Soviet system had treated logistics as something that followed combat, not the enabler of it. In war games back in Moscow, planners reran scenarios using Gulf War data, trying to insert Soviet air threats into the equation. Would American logistics have failed under attack? Could a few squadrons of fighters or a battery of Scuds disrupt the entire machine? The simulations gave them an answer they didn't expect. It wouldn't have mattered. The U.S. logistics network wasn't linear. It was modular and multi-tiered. A single depot lost meant nothing if 6 others could pick up the slack. Convoys traveled in staggered formations. Distribution nodes were relocated by air in hours. Supply lines were not lines, they were webs. The Soviet military had never imagined this. Their own doctrine assumed combat first, support second. But the Americans had flipped it. In one classified Soviet assessment, an intelligence officer wrote, "Their war machine operates like a factory. Ours operates like a parade." It was a brutal comparison, because what Moscow realized far too late was that modern warfare wasn't just about what you brought to the battlefield. It was about how fast you could replace it. And in that race, the U.S. wasn't just ahead. It was in another dimension entirely. The warning signs had been there for years. In intercepted NATO exercises, U.S. forces had demonstrated faster than expected resupply times. Satellite imagery showed mysterious container movements across Western ports. And SIGINT analysts tracked an uptick in encrypted logistics traffic between UF bases and forward-deployed elements in the Pacific and Europe. But in the halls of the KGB and GRU, these signals were misread, or worse, ignored. Why? Because Soviet intelligence wasn't trained to look at logistics as a threat vector. Their doctrine prioritized missile counts, aircraft capabilities, and radar signatures. Movement of spare parts, civilian contractors in Saudi Arabia, digital tracking systems embedded in shipping containers, not threats, not targets, not even military. In the years leading up to Desert Storm, the CIA and NSA had made major investments in logistics fusion centers, offices where real-time supply chain data was combined with battlefield requirements. Soviet analysts dismissed these as bureaucratic exercises. In reality, they were force multipliers. While the KGB focused on penetrating U.S. weapons labs, they missed the quiet revolution happening inside the U.S. Transportation Command Ustranscom, inside automated naval offload systems, inside barcoded pallets scanned by satellite-linked terminals. It wasn't glamorous, but it was lethal. One particularly glaring oversight came in 1989 when Soviet naval intelligence observed a massive offload operation at the port of Rotterdam. Thousands of containers were shifted to rail within hours, an unprecedented logistics feat. The report was filed under commercial anomaly, but it was a test run part of the U.S. military Sea Lift Command's strategy to move an armored division across the Atlantic in under 10 days. The Soviets never connected the dots. Instead, their spies continued targeting airfields, missile silos, and command bunkers, while America quietly turned warehousing into a weapon. The ultimate intelligence failure, though, came not from what the Soviets missed, but from what they refused to believe. After the Gulf War began, KGB operatives sent frantic cables back to Moscow. Reports from informants inside Kuwait, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia described a war effort run like a multinational enterprise digital manifest. Laser-guided supply convoys, field depots with preloaded inventories. Some of these reports were so detailed, Moscow suspected disinformation. One report claimed an American armor brigade had been resupplied in the middle of a sandstorm, using GPS and thermal imaging to offload ammunition in total blackout. Impossible. One analyst scrawled in the margin, but it wasn't. The KGB had spent billions penetrating defense labs, intercepting encrypted messages, and developing human assets in weapons programs. But they had no spies inside the Defense Logistics Agency, no informants inside Ustranscom, no understanding of how the American military had made movement itself a core warfighting capability. It wasn't just an oversight. It was a blind spot, and it would cost them the Cold War. To the Soviet mind, the American military-industrial complex had always seemed like a lumbering beast, vast, wasteful, and arrogant. It was a system built on money, not discipline, a machine driven by corporations, not commissars. Moscow believed it could never be agile, never truly strategic. But by 1991, the truth was undeniable. The U.S. didn't just have better equipment. It had engineered a system, one so sophisticated, so invisible, that Soviet generals didn't recognize it until it had already shattered the rules of war. It began with scale. During Operation Desert Shield, the United States moved over 500,000 troops and nearly 4 million tons of equipment halfway around the globe in a matter of weeks. This wasn't a military campaign, it was a logistical miracle. More than 230 ships, including 94 from the Military Sealift Command, carried tanks, helicopters, food, munitions, and fuel across oceans without pause. It was the largest airlift since Berlin, and it was executed with civilian contractors, private logistics networks, and automated routing systems. Soviet commanders were stunned. Their own war plans had assumed weeks, months for a buildup of that scale. The Americans had done it in days. But that was just the beginning. The core of the American system was integration. Every component, from warehouse inventory to field operations, was linked, not by ideology, not by command decree, but by data in the U.S. supply chain. Logistics officers carried handheld scanners. Barcodes tracked every item from factory to foxhole. GPS was embedded into convoy routes. Refueling schedules were mapped to satellite intelligence. Medical units could request supplies digitally and receive them within hours across continents. To the Soviets, it was unthinkable. Because in their world, information flowed up, was processed by committee, and returned often too late. In the U.S. system, information moved sideways between units, across services, even between the military and private companies. It was decentralized but synchronized. One Soviet defector described it best. They don't command. They connect. Even American maintenance was a revelation. U.S. Tanks in the Gulf were fitted with diagnostic ports. Mechanics plugged in laptops, read error codes, and requested parts before failures occurred. Soviet crews still relied on paper manuals and intuition, but what truly terrified Soviet planners was how quietly this revolution had happened. The American war machine didn't advertise its logistics. It didn't posture. While the Soviets built parades, the Americans built platforms, Walmart-style inventory systems, just-in-time resupply chains, cross-service coordination centers that could turn a Marine supply request into a Navy airdrop within hours. And none of it looked like war, but it was war. It was war fought in warehouses, war fought in shipping manifests, war fought in time zones. Because while Soviet generals measured victory in terrain taken or divisions deployed, the U.S. measured it in tempo, how fast it could kill, how fast it could move, how fast it could replenish. And that tempo was relentless. Every bomb dropped was instantly replaced. Every vehicle lost had another staged. Every wounded soldier entered a triage pipeline that restored combat power faster than the Soviets could even react. The UEDA system wasn't just efficient, it was inescapable. By the end of the Gulf War, Soviet observers realized they had lost more than a battle. They had lost the very idea of how war worked. The Red Army had been built to fight attrition, but America had built something else entirely. A military that didn't just plan for combat. It planned for everything. The Gulf War didn't just break Saddam's army, it shattered Soviet confidence. By the time Operation Desert Storm entered its ground phase in late February 1991, the world was watching with bated breath. Soviet military attachés, analysts, and advisors had gathered intelligence for weeks, expecting a slow, attritional campaign against well-dug-in Iraqi forces armed with Soviet-made tanks, air defenses, and Doctrine. What followed was a slaughter. In just 100 hours, the United States and its coalition allies overran Iraq's elite Republican Guard. Soviet-built T-72s were obliterated by M1 Abrams tanks before they could fire a shot. Iraqi anti-aircraft batteries stocked with Soviet SA-series missiles were neutralized or bypassed entirely. Radar stations went blind, command posts evaporated, supply lines collapsed. To Moscow's horror, the U.S. had made war look easy. And behind every dead Iraqi tank, behind every cratered bunker and every vanishing radar screen, Soviet engineers saw their own systems failing. Systems they had once sold as the backbone of global revolution. In one intercepted phone call, a KGB colonel in Baghdad whispered, "We are watching our future burn." But the true humiliation didn't come on the battlefield. It came in comparison. The M1 Abrams didn't just survive, it dominated. The Bradley fighting vehicle, once mocked in Soviet military journals as a death trap, tore through BMPs with Tau missiles. American Apaches hunted from the sky like wolves, coordinating with drones and command satellites to erase entire columns in minutes. And then there was the logistics. As Soviet doctrine buckled, American fuel convoys surged forward without pause. Iraqi troops, trained in Soviet-style logistics, surrendered in droves, starving, confused, disoriented. Their resupply had vanished. Their command structure failed. They had never trained for a war that moved this fast. One Iraqi general later confessed to U.S. interrogators, "We thought your tanks would get stuck in the desert. Instead, they never stopped." Moscow was mortified. By late March, secret cables from GRU and KGB field agents confirmed the unthinkable. The entire Soviet way of war had been outpaced logistically, technologically, doctrinally. The humiliation became personal. Back in Moscow, Soviet generals were forced to watch as CNN broadcast real-time images of their flagship tanks burning in the Kuwaiti desert, as their radars failed, as Iraqi forces, trained by Soviet advisors, fled faster than they could be ordered to stand. They weren't just defeated, they were discredited. In military academies from Frunze to Vladivostok, officers began whispering the unspoken truth. If the United States had launched a ground war in Europe with this system, this speed, this precision, this resupply chain, they would have reached Berlin in less than 2 weeks. What made it worse was that there had been no heroics, no grand speeches, no ideological fervor, just a cold, efficient dismantling of an entire war machine. The Soviet Union had always seen war as a struggle of will, manpower, and sacrifice, but the Americans had reduced it to math, and they had won. The Soviet war machine had endured famine, siege, and decades of brutal modernization. It had stared down Hitler, carved up Eastern Europe, and poured rivers of steel into the Cold War standoff. But it had never faced anything like the logistical shockwave of the Gulf War. This wasn't defeat in a firefight. It was systemic collapse. Inside the Kremlin, the implications were catastrophic. The Soviet General Staff, steeped in layered doctrines of deep battle and armored wave assault, found itself staring into a strategic abyss. The entire foundation of their global military power mass, volume, attrition had been rendered obsolete in 100 hours. Even worse, there was no counter-strategy. Nuclear weapons still existed, but they were now useless in the real world of rapid, conventional warfare. Ballistic missiles couldn't stop American logistics. Propaganda couldn't reverse satellite imagery. No tank division could close the gap between Soviet doctrine and American execution. By mid-1991, internal reports circulated among top Soviet strategists with phrases that hadn't been used in decades: asymmetrical dominance, logistical encirclement, irrecoverable delay. These weren't just military terms, they were death sentences for the entire Soviet concept of war. Ideologically, the damage was even worse. For years, the Soviet Union had projected itself as a military superpower, even as its economy stagnated and its politics fractured. The myth of invincibility, the idea that it could match or even surpass American force, held the system together. That myth was gone. Soviet allies in the Warsaw Pact quietly rewrote their war plans. Communist regimes across the globe reconsidered their procurement contracts. Nations that had once looked to Moscow for training and doctrine suddenly turned to Washington for answers. In East Germany, a senior general was quoted as saying, "We always feared the American bombers. We should have feared their freight trains." Inside the Politburo, reformers seized the moment. Hardliners, rattled by what they had seen in Kuwait, lost influence overnight. Military budgets shrank. Strategic priorities shifted. And within months, the Soviet Empire itself began to unravel, not because of ideology or rebellion, but because its generals had no answers left. The collapse wasn't loud. It was quiet. A quiet realization that while Soviet tanks had rusted in hangars, America had built a military without friction, a system that could launch, fight, resupply, and win faster than the Soviets could think. That realization didn't just end a war, it ended an era.